Hello YouTube. Today we're going to be talking about antimatter, what constitutes antimatter, and how you can adapt your strategy to be an antimatter player. Okay, the first deck that we're going to talk about is Evil Swarm. Now, Evil Swarm came out at a time when Mermail was the most dominant deck in the meta, and later soon to be replaced by Dragon Rulers and Spellbooks. Now, the reason this deck was so popular is because of Evil Swarm Ophion. Evil Swarm Ophion is what we call a floodgate, and that basically means your opponent can't play the game whilst you have that card on the board. They have to get rid of it, or they can't play the game. Ophion was able to stop the dragons from summoning themselves, and in the case of the Spellbook matchup, the deck adapted, and it played cards like this. Eradicator. The point of antimatter is that you size up the meta, decide what the most dangerous threats are, and then you counter it. And if you have a strategy which revolves around making this card, then you can counter the dragon matchup, which means the rest of your deck should be more geared towards the other matchups that you're going to have problems with. A card like Eradicator allows you to take away threats. It gives you information about your opponent's hand, and it's just generally a very brutal card when it resolves. It's like Crush Card Virus. Now, the next deck that I want to talk about is Rabbit. I mentioned this in my previous video and I used it as an example because this is anti-meta at its finest. When Rabbit first came out, it came out in a very pure version which ran Pot of Avarice, a small trap lineup, Veilers, Maxis, but it eventually included Macrocosmos. Whereas Macrocosmos was originally a side deck card for the deck, soon it became a main deck choice, and this is because it was extremely good against Insectors, Chaos Dragons, and Mermail. Now, the reason the deck was able to play Macrocosmos is because it wasn't hindered by it at all. A card like Jurak Guiber, which gives you another monster from the deck, is not hurt by Macrocosmos because the monster destroyed does not have to go to the grave. It just has to be destroyed. So Macrocosmos was able to hurt the rest of the meta, and you were still able to do all of your tricks and bring out Lagia, Dolka, etc. to control the game. That's why a deck like Rabbit, and especially Macro Rabbit, was extremely popular. You have to see if floodgates can fit into your deck and don't hinder your strategy. Now, when Rabbit came out, a lot of people decided to play Smashing Ground. And they played Smashing Ground because they looked at the rest of the meta and they analysed the problems, the limitations of the deck. One of the biggest limitations was the attack points of your boss monsters. Lagia was 2400 and Dolka was 2300. Which meant that if your opponent was able to summon, say, a Utopia, or, I'm going back a few years here, but a big guy, you'd have problems, because you weren't able to get it off the board. Now, eventually, people replaced Smashing Ground with Soul Taker, and they did this for a couple of reasons. On the face of it, Smashing Ground is the superior choice. It doesn't target, and Soul Taker means that you give your opponent 1,000 life points, which is normally quite disadvantageous. But Soul Taker was used because it countered threats in the meta, namely Elemental Hero the Shining and Light Pulsar Dragon. Light Pulsar Dragon created a loop with red eyes, whereby if one died you can bring back the other, and it was really annoying. But Soul Taker dealt with that problem. So, being anti-meta is having the ability to look at the meta and decide which card choices are going to give you those advantages. Similarly, when we're looking at a deck like Evil Swarm, you can look at cards like this. Infestation Pandemic. Infestation Pandemic is a blanket lance for the deck, but it's not necessary to run it at 3 copies in every single format. You have to look at the meta and you have to see how many spells and trap cards are really exist that can get rid of Ophion. For example, during Dragon Ruler format, dragons had next to no trap cards in the deck, and spell cards few and far between, so they weren't going to be removing Ophion in that way. So it wasn't necessary to max out. However, as formats have gone on, for example, last year we had Yugioh, Heart, etc. If you have heavy back row formats, then Pandemic is amazing because you can tutor it from the deck with Ophion, and it protects all of your monsters. Similarly, you can assess the meta and use cards like this. As I showed you Eradicator before, Deck Devastation is a similar card, but it deals with a different problem. You have to choose which cards are more suited against the meta. Next, let's talk about Masked Hero Darklaw. Masked Hero Darklaw is another boss monster / pseudo floodgate monster. And that's because, although heroes have been around for years, and they've always been there or thereabouts with Stratos, and they've taken wins at points in the game, they've never been dominant, but they are respectable anti-meta material, and that's because this card is Macrocosmos on legs. The way that the hero players build their decks is to give them access to this card as soon as possible, because they know that if they can get this card, they can lock their opponent down. And in order to do this, they use cards like A Hero Lives. Being anti-meta means being brave. It means accepting that you're going to be going into games with a disadvantage, but you can swing that into an advantage if you're brave. A lot of people disregard this card because of its high cost. You're giving up half of your life points, but the reward is far greater. For example, in this deck, you search Shadow Mist. Shadow Mist, when it's summoned, searches you Mask Change, and then when you use the Mask Change on the Shadow Mist, presumably not in the same turn, so as you can get the effect of Shadow Mist, then you get to add a Bubble Man, an Alias, or if you're Japan, you're quite lucky, you get to add a Stratos. But that's the theory behind the deck. The deck has a multitude of ways to go into Masked Hero Darklaw. You use things like Goblin Bird, Call of the Haunted, everything to grab you the Mask Change to make that happen. Because it's a floodgate, it's anti-meta. The penultimate thing I want to talk about is specific card choices and how they relate to the meta. For example, we looked at Macrocosmos before, and now we're looking at Defissure. Defissure is a card that can be run by certain decks and not by others. Macrocosmos is a more brutal form of the card, but Defissure is easier to use simply because we got the XYZ mechanic, and with XYZ monsters, the materials go to the grave if you have Defissure on the field, whereas with Macrocosmos they would be banished, so more decks can play it. So you should really be looking at cards like this if you want to play anti-meta. Next, Black Horn of Heaven. There is a reason why this card isn't played at all at the moment, because it doesn't have the purpose, as much utility as it used to. Backtrack a year and you had things like Yugioh, a deck which exceeded every single turn, Lightsworn, a deck which you never ever wanted to see Judgment Dragon, and Black Horn would counter that. In a synchro heavy format, Black Horn of Heaven, again, it shines. At the moment, not so much. You're looking at decks like Necros, who summon everything through their mirrors. You're looking at Shadows, who summon everything through their fusion cards. So it's not as relevant. You need to pick and time cards like this. Your trap cards are especially important. Now, possible models for anti-meta. You have to look at engines which benefit you. And cards like Traptrix Mamelio are extremely useful. You may or may not have seen the Hat deck, which Corey McDuffie won North American Nationals with last year. That's a fantastic deck, and it's anti-meta, but it's flexible because of the trap lineup. The trap lineup is always going to be important in anti-meta, unless you're relying on monster floodgates, like the Hero strategy or the Evil Swarm strategy. But even with those decks, you can include a good trap lineup to counter the rest of the meta. Now, Time Space Trap Hole, for example, is a card which is good against some decks, but not so good against others. So it can be sided. However, if you're being anti-meta, which I strongly encourage because it's a lot of fun at the end of the day, because you're strategizing to beat a deck. You have a goal in mind, you know exactly what you need to do, you know exactly which cards are good against that deck, so you need to find a way to gel them all together. So having cards like Mamelio in your deck, which provide free pluses, and being able to get you to cards which destroy your opponent, is a great way of being anti-meta. I'd just like to thank you for watching the video, and I hope you enjoy this content, and I strongly encourage you to try anti-meta decks in the future. Bye!